and he's a specialist in biostatistics, clinical trials, and clinical research education. And I guess was working hard because it says here in my cheat sheet that he led clinical trials during about COVID. And our third presenter is Dr. Paul Perrin, who is professor of data science and psychology at UVA as well. And he focuses on social justice and disability and health. I also understand that Dr. Perrin is speaking us from France, where I hope he's not on vacation, but if he is, I am doubly indebted to him. So again, welcome, gentlemen. And Jack, I'm going to give it to you.
Okay, let me see if I can share my screen here. Hoping that you can see my screen. And then,
yes, we can.
Okay. Can you see that? Does that look okay? Yep. My title slide?
Looks great.
Fantastic. Everyone, thank you so much. We're really delighted to be able to present to you. We realize that to some of you, data science might seem as a bit of an anathema to some of the statistical methodologies that you typically do, but I want to try to convince you in my brief remarks here, before we hear from Dr. Stewart and Dr. Perrin, that data science really is a friend to clinical trials and to traditional statistical methods, and is increasingly, if you haven't noticed, playing a role in clinical research. So just a little bit about myself. As Dr. Quigg mentioned, I am jointly appointed in the Department of Psychology and in the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. I did my PhD in psychology at the University of London in England, and I also have a master's degree in electrical engineering from Maryland. And I've been around a little bit, from going to Dartmouth College in New Hampshire to UCLA and USC in California, and then back here to the University of Virginia. And so again, I'm delighted to talk to you today. So one of the things which I think many of us who kind of grew up in that traditional statistical framework was this famous quote by R.A. Fisher, who for many of you know much of his work. We are really grateful to him for all the statistical contributions. And he is, of course, the F in the F statistic, inventor of a lot of different methodologies that we use every day. But he was quoted as saying, "Modern statisticians are familiar with the notion that any finite body of data contains only a limited amount of information. On any point under examination, that this limit is set by the nature of the data themselves and cannot be increased by any amount of ingenuity expanded in their statistical examination. That the statistician's task, in fact, is limited to the extraction of the whole of the available information on any particular issue." And I think really this kind of boils down to, basically your data really needs to be well regulated, well controlled, because of that limited amount of information that is there, but that our job is to go and try and extract that level of information. Well, I think one of the things which has driven a lot of this interest in data science is this, what's been called the fourth research paradigm. And this is born out of a book that came out a number of years ago now, really under the inspiration from the late Jim Gray, that we've been seeing these different kind of epochs of data acquisition and how we describe various things around us. So 1,000 years ago, experimental science kind of got its start with descriptions of natural phenomenon. And then in the last few hundred years, a theoretical science has emerged involving Newton's laws, Maxwell's equations, experimental design, statistical inference, etc. And over the last few decades, computational science with rigorous analysis and simulation of complex phenomena have emerged. But then in the present day, we are just simply overwhelmed with data from so many different and disparate sources. Data is being captured by instruments, it's being created in simulations, generated by sensor networks, by brain imaging systems, for example, and the phones that we carry around with us every day are also generating lots of data either through our own intervention or on behalf of us, and that data science is a set of tools and technologies seeking to support the data federation and collaboration, looking at analysis and mining and visualization, and also supporting scholarly communication as well as dissemination. So data science is an interdisciplinary field which is really built upon and seeks to extend the traditional statistical toolkit and methodologies by integrating advanced techniques and high-performance computing to extract new insights and to build the predictive models from complex data sets such as those that I described. So traditional statistics, while it's tended to focus on inference and hypothesis testing and relatively structured data, there you might think about clinical trials where things are really rigorously formatted and well structured and well described. Data science tends to embrace a broader toolkit, including statistical learning methodologies, many of which are going into the recent AI evolution that we're going through, multivariate analyses, Bayesian inference, Markovian processes, time series analysis, clustering, network theory, partial differential equations, just to name a few, all being brought to bear to uncover unseen patterns and dynamics in the data, which may then lend themselves to further examination using additional and more well understood statistical methods. This fusion of methods really permits us to tackle problems of the super high dimensionality of data, its complexity, really hoping to make data science a complementary and transformative component of a complete set of tools that we have in our statistical and analytical approaches to understanding data. Again, examples will include machine learning, AI, deep learning, large language models, all sorts of different methods that can drive analyses, especially in this era of increasingly large data sets. Born out of this kind of emerging interest in data-intensive science, in May of 2024, the UVA School of Data Science moved into a new home on the grounds of the University of Virginia, a state-of-the-art facility really designed and built around the idea of collaboration and research in the realm of data science. We're still getting used to this building, even though we've been in there for a little bit. But it's 4 stories. It's really quite large, and we have some support from foundations and corporate entities to help support various spaces in there that are really built for showcasing data and the data science which goes into it. It is just the first of there's a second building that is going to be, ground is being broken soon to extend the footprint of data science on the grounds of the University of Virginia, and we're very excited about that next phase, which I think should begin in the next few months in breaking ground. And all of this was made possible by one of the largest donations to the University of Virginia, like ever. I think it was $180 million to get this school started. And we were at least among the very first schools of data science in the country. So UVA is all in on this idea of data science, and we're very excited to be part of that. Our data science model that we've sort of built much of our curriculum in teaching. We have a bachelor's degree program, we have a master's degree program, and a PhD program. All of those, as well as how we're developing our faculty, is based on this idea of what we call the 4+1 model of data science. This was articulated very elegantly by our colleague Rafael Alvarado in a paper that you can find there on arXiv. And it breaks down to this 4+1 model of systems, value, design, analytics, and the +1 part is practice. That is bringing all of those different elements together in the application of them in the context of some like purposeful, useful application. We like to think of the systems and value being the more kind of concrete things, systems and analytics being more kind of the machine-based, analytics and design being a little more abstract, and then value and design being a little more of the human element in this. And so that is really how we're kind of building many of our educational programs, many of our courses, and how we're doing our faculty hiring. Here's just a few examples of some of the types of work that's been going on by faculty based in the School of Data Science, looking at contextual transparency for automated decision systems. So it's kind of sounds like a bit engineering heavy. Some work from our colleague Stephen Bake is looking at synthetic microstructure of various kind of substances and how they fracture under particular pressure, and whether or not he can generate basically simulations of that, as well as work from our colleague Teague Henry in his laboratory of doing a number of different statistical sampling methodologies and looking at their various properties. A couple of other things are looking at clustering for cell type annotation in SC ATAC data using pre-trained embeddings, and getting information about how best practices and things like leadership from our Dean Phil Bourne, who used to be the director of the Office of Data Science at the National Institutes of Health a few years ago. But some of my own work has been looking, which I think will jibe with this audience, of looking at statistical power, is downloading data from archives on the internet that provide results, images from human neuroimaging studies. In this case, this is subjects looking at emotional faces, and this is their response in the area called the amygdala of the brain, and trying to scale things to look at the statistical power based upon a number of different parameters. In this case, looking at, let's say, a Cohen's F-squared value of 0.2, and looking at various sample sizes and various levels of power to be able to tell when, at what sample size and at what level of power would be sufficient for being able to detect that activation in the amygdala in this particular task paradigm. So we're very excited about that. And also using second generation p-values to look at those inferences. Some of these slides about the numerics of the School of Data Science are probably out of date, largely because we've been hiring faculty like crazy. I believe that we had this past year, we had 15 calls for applications for new faculty. So some of these numbers may be a little out of date. We have an increasing number of undergraduate students. I believe the number 75 there was what we had last fall. That number is increasing quite considerably. We have both in residence master's degree program as well as an online master's degree program. And we have about 40 or possibly more PhD students in the pipeline right now. And Tom may be able to correct me, as he's our director of our PhD program, about those current numbers. But a growing number of students, a growing number of faculty, and there's a growing number of active grants that are very exciting to be able to be pursuing. Some of these are, there's a recent one, which I was involved with getting an NIH S10 grant to deploy state-of-the-art NVIDIA GPU processing units dedicated to the data science associated with brain research. We've held things in the school, like an art competition, data is art competition last year, drawing more than 140 entries from 9 countries, and having guest lecturers and featured displays now around that new building I mentioned. Our master's degree students complete consulting projects as part of a program on topics like human healthcare, human trafficking, market analysis, and animal poaching. And we're building a collection of different research partnerships with groups like Lawrence Livermore and the IMT Scuola Alti study in Lucca, Italy, which is very exciting. And we've received funding from the NIH and a number of other different federal and private foundations. So this is particularly important because the NIH programs and NIH data science initiatives are really looking to address certain priorities in the space of clinical trials, improving particularly involving the findability, interconnectivity, and interoperability of NIH-funded biomedical data sets and resources. This includes kind of pre-registration, among other things, integrating existing data management tools and developing new ones, universalizing innovative algorithms and tools created by academic scientists, and really addressing the growing costs of managing all the data that we collect, and enhancing human-derived data for research, providing new opportunities in software, computational methods, and artificial intelligence, and supporting the biomedical research data infrastructure, because we just don't collect less data. We continue to collect more data, and doing it strategically and intelligently in the space of clinical trials is super important as we go from having raw responders of data, maybe developing machine learning methodologies that help us make more accurate predictions, for example, about those who will respond to a particular treatment against those who do not, leveraging as much of that data as we are able to. Here are several recent examples drawn from the literature of where data science has been applied to clinical research. There's a number of different things looking at the use of machine learning and its effectiveness in assessing outcome ascertainment in clinical trials. Deep learning has been applied in silico screening of anti-cancer drugs at the single cell level. Outcome prediction in patients with severe traumatic brain injury using deep learning, and evaluation of things like large language models, including the one that we're probably all very familiar with is ChatGPT, in predicting 6 months outcome after TBI. My colleague Paul Perrin will be able to tell us probably a little bit more about the work that he's been doing with traumatic brain injury during his talk. Really, we like to think of data science as kind of a nation of immigrants. There is usually no real card-carrying data scientist. There haven't, up to this date, there haven't been any real programs in it. So a lot of us in the School of Data Science come from other disciplines, whether it's computer science, math, and statistics, my own background in psychology, people developing software tools or doing traditional research. We all kind of come together around this idea of data science, really looking at study design and engineering, how we manage data, how we share data, how we make that data fair, the development of systems design. So that example of that S10 NIH grant that we got to build that cluster is going to be important. Certainly looking at advanced mathematics and also bringing domain knowledge, whether it's in biomedicine or in business. And I do want to assure you that data scientists do also subscribe to a lot of the traditional statistical expectations about things like statistical significance and power and those types of things. So again, this is a complementary element to the traditional statistical analyses, including but seeking to push the boundaries of general linear models, probabilities, ODEs, etc. So in today's talk, you've heard from me a little bit with a little preamble about what data science is and what we think it is at the University of Virginia. My colleague Tom Stewart will give his presentation next, and Tom's a real good person to take the next step because he has been very involved in clinical trials. He has Dr. Quigg mentioned that he was involved in a number of different COVID-related activities, so he'll be able to feature some of that work. And then my colleague Paul Perrin will be able to talk about some of his work, in particular some of his work, I believe, in looking at traumatic brain injury in military veterans and some of the health disparities and where data science falls into that. So this is kind of, I think, how this is going to break down, and with Tom and then Paul. And then if anybody is interested in any of my own work, here is a collection of different things related to bridging biomedical and data science. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to share any of those links with you. And we do invite you to come and visit us at the School of Data Science, where we are very proud of our new facility. We like to show it off, and we hope that we can show it off to you. And so with that, let me pass it over to my colleague, Tom Stewart. So I'm going to stop sharing. And please save any questions. Well, I think we'll have some Q&A time at the end. So you please bring any questions that you have for us. Tom, take it away.
Great. Can you see that?
Yes.
Fantastic. Great. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to address this group. Today, I kind of want to talk about two things in the 10 minutes that I have. The first is thinking about how data science impacts clinical trials, but if there's time at the end, I'd love to also talk about how currently clinical trials are actually evaluating data science, which is kind of an interesting, new, and I think exciting area of research. So I'm going to start out by talking about monitoring in a decentralized trial. And as Jack mentioned, I've been associated with Active-6. Active-6 was a platform trial for mild to moderate COVID-19. And so rather than evaluating a single intervention, a platform trial evaluates several interventions. And sometimes the interventions are evaluated simultaneously, and sometimes they're evaluated sequentially. But the great thing about a platform trial is that all of the treatments are evaluated under a single master protocol. And by designing a trial this way, there can be some efficiency gains, especially if we're in a situation where we can share placebos across the multiple interventions. And by sharing, I mean, taking an example, Active-6 an example. If we randomize a participant to be placebo in the fluticasone arm, perhaps they can also be used as a placebo in the fluvoxamine arm. And we can get some efficiency gains, reduce the total sample size that's needed to achieve the same level of evidence. Active-6 evaluated 5 different drugs, and 2 of those drugs were evaluated at multiple doses. So in total, there were 7 appendices, and appendices is the term that's used in these platform trials to denote kind of that individual unit. And the primary acute outcome in this trial was time to sustained recovery. And that's the number of days from the receipt of the study drug to the third of 3 consecutive days without COVID-19 symptoms. Because there was so much interest in long COVID, the final appendix, that metformin appendix, was actually extended to evaluate that long COVID outcome in addition to the primary acute outcomes. Now, another interesting thing about Active-6 is that it was a decentralized study. Participants could join the study remotely from their phones or from their computers. They could also join through traditional sites like the doctor's office or the medical center. And if the participant was eligible, they were randomized, and the study pharmacy would ship the assigned study drug directly to the participant's home. And from enrollment to drug delivery to follow-up, the participants would essentially report their symptoms and any other events through an online or a phone survey every single day. Now, decentralized trials can have a lot of advantages. And this is an example of a paper that we wrote in the Journal of Clinical Translational Science, all about the lessons that were learned by many different research groups who engage in this type of research. Now, I think there are a lot of positives to decentralized trials. An important one that we observed in Active-6 was enrollment from every state and enrollment in very remote communities, which was something that was fantastic to see during the pandemic. And it just meant that we were, the participants that we enrolled were much better, much more representative of the population than we typically see in clinical trials. Now, a decentralized trial does not come without its unique challenges. And I think some of these challenges that we saw in decentralized trials are ripe for contributions from data science. One challenge observed in Active-6 was the need for participant-facing materials in multiple languages. And for a rapidly changing disease like COVID-19, a 2-week lag for translation and approval could result in many individuals unable to participate simply because of the language barrier. Now, this isn't my area of expertise, but I anticipate that the emergence of these high-quality translations from large language models will have an important role to play in future clinical trials to overcome this particular barrier. Another area where I think data science can help clinical trials is with data collection and retention. And I actually view data collection and retention as being two sides of the same coin. If we can minimize the data collection burden, we can often have a really positive impact on participant retention. And thinking about our curriculum in data science, I really hope that our kind of user-focused design curriculum in data science will permeate to the data collection that we do in clinical trials. All of that work to minimize clicks can have a really big impact on the participants in our trials. Now, lastly, I'll mention an area where data scientists have contributed for decades, and that's with monitoring. And monitoring efforts have often leveraged data science tools, but I think there's been some advances in computer vision and large language models that will improve our data integrity efforts moving forward. And I've got one example from Active 6, and I'm going to invite a little participation from the audience here. As part of the enrollment process in Active 6, participants had to upload documentation of a positive COVID-19 test. And as you can imagine, often that documentation was just a picture that a participant would take with their phone of their home COVID-19 test. Now there's one little challenge. How do we verify that the photo is legitimately from the participant? And so to kind of illustrate this, I've got here a photo that I took of a COVID-19 test that I took at some point during the pandemic, and another one that I just pulled from the internet. And I'm curious, which one do you think is mine, and which one do you think is from the internet? And you can put your stuff, you can put your answer in the chat, left or right. The right is, okay, we've got Fontaine saying the right is fake, internet is right. Okay, and I'm curious, and feel free to have a little bit of a, to unmute yourself and actually just talk about this a little bit. For those that thought it was, the internet one was from the right, why did you think it was the internet one? Okay, we got a comment, no shadow. Okay, the glossy table, right. So clearly the one on the right is,
All right, thanks so much, Tom. Let me do a screen share. All right, hi everyone. My name is Paul Perrin. As some of my colleagues mentioned, I'm a faculty member in the School of Data Science and Department of Psychology. So I'm a rehabilitation psychologist by training or by birth, and a data scientist by adoption. And so I really try to bridge the gap between clinical practice and data science, particularly in the context of individuals with neurological conditions. So I study folks with neurotrauma, predominantly traumatic brain injury, but also stroke, spinal cord injury, and neurodegenerative diseases. So I'm going to show some results from a study that we published recently. So this presentation is called Psychometric Network Analysis as an Outcome Tool in Clinical Trials. Demonstration in longitudinal depression symptoms of veterans and service members after TBI. So this paper came out in Rehabilitation Psychology at the end of 2024. We have a couple data science colleagues who are co-authors on this, including Alex Gates and Teague Henry. It's just a disclaimer, because I'm presenting VA data, the presentation represents my opinions and not those of the federal government. So you may be aware that traumatic brain injury has been designated the signature injury of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And since 2000, over 430,000 cases of TBI have occurred among folks in the military. The number is actually just above 500,000 now. And about 80% of these are considered a mild TBI. TBI and depression are pretty common comorbidities. So the prevalence rates of major depressive disorder range pretty dramatically after TBI, depending on the study. So the rates have been shown to be between 17% and 61%, depending on the study and the population. But a meta-analysis suggested that the prevalence rates for MDD or dysthymia after TBI was about 27%, and the prevalence for clinically significant depressive symptoms is 38%. So you're probably familiar, if you've done any clinical work, with the Patient Health Questionnaire 9, the PHQ-9, or you might have used the PHQ-2, the first two items on that measure, as a screener for depressive symptoms. So it's a 9-item self-report scale, and it's really the most common measure of depressive symptoms. And it's often used in people with TBI. So the items correspond to the criteria on the DSM-4 and 5 for major depressive disorder. This is the PHQ-9. So participants will respond to the prompt over the last 2 weeks. How often have you been bothered by any of the following problems? And then these are all of the symptoms of major depressive disorder. So we decided to use a psychometric network approach to investigating depressive symptoms after TBI. So a traditional symptom conceptualization really operates from kind of a common cause assumption. So the idea is that there's this thing called depression or major depressive disorder, and it exists in the real world. And because people have this thing called depression, people's items on a scale that taps into it, maybe tapping into fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and mood, those scores are all reflective of this underlying construct of depression. But what network psychometrics does, by contrast, is it understands how observed symptoms relate directly. So in other words, somebody might experience fatigue after a TBI that might create difficulty concentrating. Difficulty concentrating might create mood problems, and there might be a cyclical loop that occurs among those three symptoms. So the idea here is that symptom systems are actually complex systems. And so network psychometrics conceptualizes pathology as partially resulting from the interaction of symptoms and problems over time. So depressive symptoms might be self-sustaining. It might be a self-sustaining feedback loop of symptoms. And then when you consider this type of framing in the context of a randomized clinical trial and its effects on symptoms, a traditional research question is kind of this common cause question of how does an RCT, or maybe TBI in this case, impact symptom severity? But by contrast, network science asks how this external event, be that an RCT or sustaining a TBI or sustaining some other health condition, how does that change the symptom system so that pathology is reduced or changes? So in this study, we wanted to demonstrate the application of network analysis to the PHQ-9 in a sample of veterans and service members at 1 and 2 years after TBI. And in this paper, we also wanted to create an accessible, user-friendly introduction to machine learning applications in clinical research. So I'd highly suggest you check out the paper if you're interested. If I were to ask you what the most common statistical analysis you use in some of your work is, you'd probably say one of two things. You might say a logistic regression, if maybe you're more kind of public health minded, or you might even say an analysis of variance, or kind of repeated measures analysis of variance, if you're comparing two groups on some outcome. But if you think about it, the logistic function was actually developed in the 1830s. And then the logistic regression as a statistical model actually dates from the 1940s or 1950s. So I would make the argument that because clinical approaches and evidence-based clinical work has changed dramatically from the 1940s and 1950s, so too have the methods that we have available to us to study change in those systems, or change in whatever the outcome is that we're interested in looking at. All right, so in this study, all participants came from the Department of Veterans Affairs Polytrauma Rehabilitation Center TBI Model Systems Study. And so we have 5 sites across the U.S. So these are all the polytrauma rehabilitation centers throughout the network. So we have the Richmond site, Minneapolis, Palo Alto, San Antonio, and Tampa. And all participants in this study go through exactly the same measures. So we collect data at baseline when they're hospitalized for acute rehabilitation, and then at years 1, 2, 5, 10, and every 5 years thereafter. So here in this study, we're going to look at their follow-up interview data on the PHQ-9 at years 1 and 2 post-injury. Sample characteristics, we have just over 800 participants with TBI, a very racially and ethnically diverse group, pretty good range across mild, moderate, severe, and then some of these other categories. Average age is 37. And then in terms of causes, the most common cause was vehicular, although right after that was various mechanisms of injury associated with violence, and then falls is kind of the third largest cause. So for data analysis, anybody who does network science might appreciate this. So we utilize the Epic-Glasso estimation routine to estimate a network of partial correlations. So all that is a bunch of correlations that control for all other associations within the system. And we subjected this to regularization, which is a machine learning algorithm that repeatedly reduces the smallest edges in the network to 0. We used 5,000 bootstrap samples, and we used several R packages in order to do this. So in terms of results, at year 1, participants' mean PHQ-9 score was 7.23, and so 32.8% of the sample met or surpassed the clinical cutoff of a score of 10. At year 2, mean score was 7.77, and about 35% met or surpassed the clinical cutoff for major depressive disorder. When you look at network science, there's a little bit of terminology that you have to learn. So a node is any cross-sectional variable. So here, these are items or symptoms of depression within the network. Those are represented by those circles. Edges are the partial correlations between any two nodes. And so the thicker the edges, the stronger the relationship between those nodes. Blue edges are positive and red edges are negative. So here in this network, we have all positive associations among these nodes. And then you also get an index of centrality, which is the overall influence of any particular node within the network. So in other words, it's kind of the higher the centrality, the more that symptom is holding together the entire symptom network. So this picture that I'm showing over on the right is the PHQ-9 network at year 1. So you kind of see this somatic symptom cluster up at the top of sleep, energy, appetite. And then down at the bottom, you see these affective symptoms of low mood, anhedonia, suicidal ideation, and guilt. Over here on the right, we see that suicidal ideation is connected to the entire network only through the guilt node. And then there were the strongest and most connections to low mood. So it had the highest index of centrality. So in other words, low mood is really what was holding together that symptom network. At year 2, we have that same somatic symptom cluster up at the top versus the affective symptom cluster down at the bottom. Now we see suicidal ideation connected both through guilt and also through low mood. And then again, we saw the strongest and most connections to the low mood node. Then we looked at this as a kind of an invariant model over time, which is actually ripe for randomized clinical trials because you can look at a symptom network before the trial and then a symptom network after the trial. And we found that these two networks were actually invariant, meaning that they did not change statistically over time. We also found pretty high correlations between the width of those blue lines. So in other words, if there was a strong relationship between concentration and psychomotor symptoms at time 1, we also tended to see those at time 2 as well. And in terms of centrality, so centrality again is how strongly a node is directly connected to the other symptoms within the network. So you kind of think of this as a railway station that has a lot of railway lines connecting into it. So low mood here had the highest ranking for centrality at both time 1 and time 2. So that's the symptom of feeling down, depressed, or hopeless. Guilt had the second highest index of centrality at year 1. So this is feeling bad about yourself or that you're a failure. However, that went down to the 5th highest index of centrality at year 2. By contrast, anhedonia, or little interest or pleasure in doing things, ranked 4th for centrality at year 1, but then 2nd highest for centrality at year 2. So if you take a step back, these findings really suggest that in terms of understanding how depressive symptoms work after traumatic brain injury at both years 1 and 2, there's a high centrality of feeling down, depressed, or hopeless. And this supports its primacy over the more somatic symptoms of major depressive disorder. And because we saw that invariance in the network over those first 2 years suggests a relatively stable depressive symptom structure. That high centrality for guilt at year 1 may reflect kind of early feelings of guilt about the cause of injury itself, so maybe a car accident, or practical consequences related to post-injury loss. So this might be things like loss of employment. That might include feelings of failure, or like a person let their family down. Then self-esteem, changes in sense of identity, and feeling like a burden to family members might be more central earlier after TBI, while individuals and their family members are still adjusting to that new reality post-injury. As time goes on and rehabilitation gains plateau, those affective symptoms like a little interest or pleasure in doing things might take on greater importance. So what I would just argue is that network analysis is a pretty powerful tool for exploring the structure of outcomes in your study. And so by describing the structure as a network of relations among variables, instead of this sort of traditional approach of just taking those variables as measures of kind of an underlying latent construct, you can actually identify specific variables that are highly central to the overall system. And those symptoms that have a high degree of centrality tend to be the ones that might be most important clinically to focus on, because if you get some movement in that particular symptom, it can actually help fracture the entire symptom network. And as applied to clinical trials, network analysis has a pretty high potential to enhance the field's understanding of how interventions influence a system of symptoms rather than just overall kind of outcome of higher or lower. And so to our knowledge, this is the first application of network science to investigate the structure of depressive symptoms over time in veterans and service members with TBI. It also provides a framework for the examination of other outcomes over time, including as a function of randomized clinical trials. And then we also argue that the sustained centrality of low mood over those first 2 years after injury represents a high priority for treatment targets, given its apparent role in maintaining this depressive symptom structure and possibly perpetuating or increasing suicidal ideation 2 years after TBI. Feelings of guilt at year 1 were likely reflective of self-blame, but only to be replaced centrality by anhedonia at year 2, when rehab gains might plateau. And so these findings overall provide a nuanced characterization of how depressive symptoms interact with each other over time, a sample at elevated risk and in great need of effective treatments. That's my contact information, Perrin at virginia.edu, if you'd like to chat. So I'm happy to take any questions about my study, or also open it up to my colleagues, Jack and Tom, as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate y'all's time and input and the wide variety of applications that you're bringing into the world of clinical investigation. One of the questions I had is actually something you didn't cover, but is also something that is of great need in clinical investigation, is using AI or data science tools to aid in things like outcome determination. In other words, designing the best clinical outcome that may have a better chance of showing success. So if I were like a pharmacy company and I was wanting to choose my primary outcome, is there a way that y'all's techniques could be used to statistically, use big data to derive the better kind of outcomes that maybe? So this is kind of towards where Paul was heading to is the kind of designing big techniques to evaluate the best kind of data to use. Is that something that is in y'all's horizon? Is modeling study design?
Tom, what do you think about that? I think you're probably the closest person there to be able to answer that.
So for example, in the world of epilepsy, the standard study design is to measure seizure reduction after treatment. And typically it's 50% of seizures decreased because of treatment, and that's the success. However, there are other study designs, like the time it takes for a person to first have a seizure after initiating treatment with the new medicine. And you certainly have to pick which of those designs would be most likely to show a significant result. Is there a way to kind of sort through different outcomes and tell us as investigators, oh, avoid that one, pick this one?
Well, this is an excellent question. And choosing an outcome for a clinical trial is probably one of the most important things that doesn't get discussed as much as it should be. Now, from like a statistical standpoint, we have a pretty decent idea about the kind of statistical properties that an outcome should have so that its power is maximized. But that being said, statistical efficiency isn't the only consideration in these clinical trials. As somebody who's done a lot of work in COVID, I've come to appreciate more the importance of thinking about how the results of the trial will be consumed by all of the stakeholders. And in my case, when it came to COVID, how it's going to be consumed by the general public, who were very invested to learn how things like ivermectin might impact COVID-19. So
right.
I think there's more than just the statistical considerations to take into account there. But you're kind of like
throwing some dice before you put
right
design in front of the FDA, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I'm not aware of any kind of LLMs or tools like that are specialized in designing outcomes that have those special statistical properties that make them more efficient.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if you're at the beginning stages of kind of understanding the relationships among some of the things that you might care about as outcomes, network science is pretty good at that. So yeah, we published a paper about 2 years ago trying to sort of search for the holy grail in traumatic brain injury research among veterans and service members, which is trying to disentangle the symptoms of PTSD and traumatic brain injury, because so many of them overlap. So what we did is we applied some network science to both of those sets of symptoms and kind of mapped them out. And then we found that the bridge connecting those two symptoms was actually hyperarousal. And the cool thing for psychologists is hyperarousal is actually very, very treatable. It's probably one of the most treatable symptoms. You can use, exposure therapies, mindfulness-based stress reduction, so a lot of pharmacological treatments. So in that paper, we were able to recommend that as a primary symptom that needs to be targeted when you have veterans and service members experiencing a combination of comorbid PTSD and neurobehavioral symptoms associated with traumatic brain injury. So data science absolutely can do that.
Thank you.
We have,
I throw the questions to the audience.
we have a question in the chat,
Okay.
which is and Tom just popped a link in there, but the question is, what is the best way for a clinical investigator with no previous experience or knowledge with these data tools to approach them? In other words, what should a potential collaborator bring to a meeting with a data scientist to make it productive and likely to succeed?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm glad that that got brought up because so often one of the things as data scientists is that people come to you after the data have been collected and they say, hey, can you do some cool data magic with this data? And very often we're left trying to just play catch up with trying to understand what was the hypothesis, what's been tested here, what variables are there, are there missing data, what are basically catch us up. And that can be very limiting in terms of like then what can be done. What I would recommend, and possibly this jibes with what Tom has just provided us as well, is when you're beginning to think about what your research design is going to look like and what kind of data you're going to collect, as that's the great time to get together with a data scientist and say, hey, here's what we're planning to do. Can you make some recommendations? What would you have us do differently? And really work in partnership with them, as opposed to this, we're going to go collect a bunch of really cool data that we think is cool, and then we're just going to drop it in the lap of somebody to kind of make some statistical magic happen. It's just really a good time to start thinking about this when you're planning your experiment or your data collection efforts. You'll probably notice that in a lot of NIH RFAs that data science plays an important role in many of them. And so really bringing data scientists in at this first stage of it is actually really helpful, because then everybody kind of wins and you can optimize, how you're doing your data collection, what sort of cool network analytic tools you might be applying, rather than doing it kind of as a post hoc analysis.
I know we're about out of time. The final thing I'll say is, I asked that same question so many times as a trained clinical psychologist, being used to working with patients. So the thing that I would say, the best way to work with a data scientist is probably send an email and set up a conversation. We're not so scary. And at least in the UVA School of Data Science, we're hiring so many brand new assistant professors who are just unbelievable methodologists. And so what I really try to do is I try to pair up the right people who are methodologists, maybe with clinicians who actually have worked with those patient populations. And then that way you have this merging of really advanced kind of unbelievable methods with a lot of clinical experience and kind of, just bedside approaches, because you really need that melding of kind of data science and practice to do work that's really impactful. So I'd say, don't be scared.
Absolutely.
Well, we are at our time, and we want to thank our presenters again for your excellent presentations. Thank you all for joining, and thank you all for bearing with us during our glitch, my glitch. But this concludes the 2025 CTMC webinar series. You can catch all of our previous webinars on our YouTube channel, which is linked from our website that I can put in the chat. Please take a moment to complete our survey and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.